3 men were already dead. I hadn't fired a single shot. She warned me before any of them moved. That's the part nobody believes when I tell it. Not the blood. Not the bodies. The warning. A 11-month-old girl, strapped to my chest in a parking garage, screaming into my ear a full 4 seconds before the first bullet ever left its chamber. 4 seconds. In my world, 4 seconds is the difference between a funeral and a Tuesday. My name is Deo Chukwu. 10 months ago, I didn't believe in anything I couldn't put a price on. Then I found her in the rain, and everything I thought I understood about fear, about control, about myself, came apart in my hands like wet paper. Let me take you back. Not far. Just far enough for you to understand why a man like me was running through a parking garage with a baby in one arm and a gun in the other, and why I wasn't afraid of the men shooting at us. I was afraid of what she already knew that I didn't. 10 months earlier, it was raining the way it only rains in Hanul City, sideways. Angry, like the sky had a grudge. I was closing down my warehouse on the East Docks, the one my men use for things I don't discuss with strangers, when I heard it. A cry. Thin. Human. Coming from behind a stack of crates near the loading door. I told myself to walk past it. I told myself a man in my position does not stop for strays. I have told myself a lot of things over the years that turned out to be lies. I found her wrapped in a gray blanket already soaked through, lips going blue, no note, no name. Nothing but a small gold bracelet on her wrist that didn't match anything about where she'd been left. I remember saying out loud, to no one, I don't save people. I end them. And then I picked her up anyway. I named her Amara. It means grace, in a language that isn't even mine, but it felt right the moment I said it to her, and she stopped crying and looked at me like she already knew who I was going to become. My second in command, Rosha, thought I'd lost my mind. He told me so, more than once, usually while holding a bottle of formula like it might bite him. You run 6 blocks of this city, he said to me one night, standing in my kitchen at 2 in the morning while I tried to figure out how to work a diaper. Men fear your name in 3 languages. And you're up at 2 a.m. Googling, baby won't stop crying. She's not crying because something's wrong with her, I told him. She's crying because something's wrong with the hallway. He laughed. He actually laughed at me. I didn't laugh back. You've changed, boss, he said, still smiling, still not understanding. 6 months ago, you'd have shot a man for looking at you wrong. Now you're negotiating with a 9-month-old over sweet potato puree. She won and you know it. I told him, and for once he didn't argue. Because here's the thing nobody could explain to me. Not the doctors, not the 2 consultants I paid an obscene amount of money to fly in and tell me my daughter was developmentally advanced. Amara didn't cry like other children cried. She cried at doors before anyone knocked on them. She screamed at empty rooms 30 seconds before a window shattered from a storm nobody predicted. She pointed at my driver's chest 3 days before we found out he'd been skimming money from me and selling information to a rival house. I remember that day clearly, because it was the first time I truly understood what I was raising. We were in the car, headed to a meeting I no longer even remember the purpose of, and Amara went stiff in her seat, pointing one small finger at the back of my driver's head, over and over, refusing to stop, refusing to be soothed. Is she all right? My driver asked, glancing nervously in the mirror. She's fine, I said, but I wasn't looking at her anymore. I was looking at him. I fired him quietly 3 days later, after my own men confirmed what her small finger had already told me. I didn't tell anyone why. I didn't need to. But I started watching my daughter's hands like they were the only intelligence report I trusted anymore. And I started watching the people around me the way you watch a room after you've learned it isn't as safe as you believed. You're going to drive yourself insane, Rosha told me one night, watching me review security footage for the 4th time that week, comparing it frame by frame against the exact moment Amara had turned her head toward a window. She's a baby, Deo. Babies point at things. It doesn't always mean. It has meant something every single time, I said. Every time, Rosha. Tell me when that stops being a coincidence and starts being something I need to take seriously. He didn't have an answer for that. Neither did I, not really. I just had a growing, uneasy certainty that I was raising something the world hadn't made room for yet, and that it was my job, the only job that had ever mattered to me, to make room for her, whatever it cost. That night in the parking garage, the one I opened with, that wasn't the beginning of anything. That was the moment I stopped pretending I could explain her away. We were leaving a meeting that should have been routine. Just numbers, just territory lines, nothing worth bringing security for beyond the usual 2 men. Amara had been quiet the whole car ride, which should have told me something, because quiet, for her, was never actually quiet. Then, halfway across the garage, she went rigid in my arms and started screaming a word that wasn't a word. Just sound. Raw, urgent, animal sound, and her whole small body twisted toward the stairwell to my left. I didn't ask questions. I have learned, the hard way, not to ask questions when she does that. I grabbed my driver's arm, shoved him toward the car, and started running the opposite direction from where she was pointing. For seconds later, gunfire tore through the space where I would have been standing if I had walked one more row forward. 3 men, positioned on the upper level, opened fire on a spot in that garage that had my name written all over the plan, except I wasn't there anymore, because a baby who cannot form full sentences told me not to be. I want you to sit with that. Sit with what that does to a man who has spent his whole adult life believing that control comes from information, from muscle, from money. What do you do when the most reliable intelligence you have ever received in your life comes from someone who still needs help holding a spoon? For a moment, I froze. Not from fear of the men above me, from the sheer impossibility of what had just happened. My legs made the decision before my mind caught up. I was already moving, already shielding her small body with mine, before I'd even processed why. I fought back that night. I want to tell you what that felt like, because it wasn't like the other fights. Normally, in my line of work, there's a rhythm to violence, a language I've spoken fluently since I was young enough that it stopped feeling like a choice. But that night, every movement I made had her weight pressed against my chest, her small fists gripping my shirt, and I remember thinking, with a kind of clarity I'd never had in a firefight before, if I fail tonight, it isn't just my life that ends. That thought changes a man. It changed the way I moved. It changed the way I aimed. I have never fought harder for anything in my life than I fought in that garage, not because I was afraid of dying, but because for the first time in years, I had something worth surviving for. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. 2 of the 3 men didn't walk away from that garage. The third ran, and I let him, because Amara had gone quiet again, and quiet, when it comes after the screaming, means the danger has passed. I've learned to read her like a language. I just don't understand the grammar yet. We got home a little after midnight. Rosha met us at the door, saw the blood on my collar that wasn't mine, and didn't say a word. He just took Amara from my arms so I could breathe for the first time in an hour. I thought that was the worst night of that season. I was wrong. The worst night was still 2 weeks away, and it wouldn't come with gunfire. It would come with a woman standing very still outside my gate, watching my house like she'd been waiting her whole life for the chance. Her name was Fola. I didn't know that yet when my men brought her to me, hands zip-tied, face calm in a way that unsettled me more than fear would have. She was outside the property for 6 hours, Rosha said. Didn't run, didn't fight, just kept looking at the nursery window. I stood in front of her in a room I use for conversations I don't want overheard, and I asked her the only question that mattered to me. Why my daughter's window? She looked at me for a long time before she answered, and when she did, her voice was steady in a way that made the hair on my arms rise. Because she isn't your daughter, Mr. Chukwu. Not by blood, but she was never abandoned, either. She was placed. And you don't know what you're protecting. I laughed at her. I want to be honest about that, because it wasn't a good laugh. It was the laugh of a man trying to convince himself that the ground under him hasn't just shifted. I found her in the rain, I said. Alone. Freezing. If that's a placement, whoever placed her deserves what's coming to them. Whoever placed her, Fola said, loved her enough to know that a mafia boss with your resources and your particular blindness to fear was the only person in this city who could keep her alive long enough to become who she's meant to be. I told my men to give us the room. Cut her hands loose, I said, once the door shut behind Rosha. If she wanted to hurt my daughter, she wouldn't have spent 6 hours standing in the rain doing nothing but watching a window. Fola rubbed her wrists once they were free and studied me with an expression I couldn't place at the time. Not fear, not defiance, something closer to relief, like she'd been waiting a long time for someone to finally ask her the right question. You want to know why I was watching her window, she said. Ask me properly, not as an interrogation. Ask me the way a father asks. That stopped me. I hadn't expected her to notice the difference, and I hadn't expected it to matter to me that she had. Why? I said, quieter this time. Were you watching my daughter's window? Because I've been looking for her for 10 months, Fola said. Because the night she disappeared from the people who were supposed to protect her, I promised myself I would not stop until I found out whether she was alive or whether I needed to finally let myself grieve her. And because 3 weeks ago, I heard a rumor about a mafia boss in Hanul City raising a child who reacts to danger before it happens, and I knew. I knew before I ever saw her face. You could be lying to me. I could be, she agreed. But ask yourself something, Mr. Chukwu. If I wanted her dead, why would I have spent 6 hours outside your gate instead of one night breaking in while your guard was down? I wasn't watching that window to plan an attack. I was watching it because I was afraid, once I finally saw her again, that I wouldn't be able to make myself walk away. What she told me that night rearranged everything I thought I understood about the last 10 months of my life. Amara's mother had been part of a lineage, Fola's word, not mine, and I still don't fully trust the word, that stretched back through both my late mother's Korean family and a bloodline out of Fola's own Nigerian ancestry, two threads that had crossed once, decades ago, in circumstances Fola wouldn't explain in full that night. Children born from that crossing carried something. Not a gift, Fola was careful to say. A burden. A perception that opened before the rest of them was ready for it. She sees consequence before cause, Fola said. She feels the wound before the wound exists. It will only grow sharper as she grows older. And there are people in this city, and outside it, who have spent years trying to make sure no child like her survives long enough to understand what she is. And you're telling me this because I'm her aunt, Fola said. And because the people who orphaned her the first time are already looking for her again. I didn't believe her. Not fully. Not that night. But I kept her zip-tied hands in front of me and Amara's screaming face in my memory, and something in my chest, the part of me that had learned over 10 months to trust a child's instincts over my own men's reports, told me she wasn't lying about the danger, even if she was lying about everything else. I let her go. I shouldn't have. Rosha told me so before she'd even reached the gate. You just released a woman who admitted she's been watching our house for hours, on her own word that she's family, he said. Deo, I've followed you into wars I didn't understand. I don't understand this one. Neither do I told him. That's exactly why I'm not going to make a decision I can't undo yet. He didn't argue further, but something in his eyes that night stayed with me longer than it should have. I told myself it was worry. I was wrong about that, too. The days that followed moved fast, faster than I could organize into any order that made sense while I was living them, so let me just give them to you the way they came. Amara started reacting to Rosha, not dramatically at first, a flinch when he entered a room, a refusal to be held by him, when for 10 months he'd been the one person outside me she trusted without hesitation. Then, 3 days after Fola walked out my gate, Amara did something she had never done before. She pointed directly at Rosha's chest, at his heart, and screamed the way she'd screamed in that parking garage. I told myself it was a coincidence. I told myself a lot of things that week. 2 nights later, one of my own men, someone I trusted enough to run my second warehouse, came to me with a file. Financial records. Calls placed from a burner phone registered under a name that traced back, through 3 shell accounts, to Rosha. He'd been feeding information to the same faction that hit us in that parking garage. Not for years. Not out of hatred. Out of debt. The kind that grows in the dark when a man doesn't tell you he's drowning. The kind I should have seen because I built my entire empire on knowing when men were drowning. I confronted him that night in the same room I'd used for Fola. How long, I said. It wasn't a question. It was a demand. Rosha didn't lie to me. I'll give him that. For months, he said. They found out about her. About what she does. They offered enough to clear what I owed, and all I had to do was tell them when you'd be moving, and where. You almost got her killed. I told myself it wouldn't get that far, he said, and his voice cracked in a way I'd never heard from him in 12 years of standing beside me. I told myself I could control it. You stood in that garage with me, I said, and I could hear my own voice shaking now, something I hadn't allowed myself in front of him in over a decade. You carried her out of the car yourself that morning. You looked her in the face, Rosha. I know. Then how? I stopped, because I genuinely didn't understand, and some part of me needed to, more than I needed to be angry. How do you look a child in the face and still make that call? Because I told myself she'd never even know, he said. And for the first time since I'd known him, he looked like a much younger, much smaller man than the one who'd stood beside me through a dozen wars. I told myself you were strong enough to handle whatever came, that you always had been, and that my debt would be the only thing that got settled. I was wrong about all of it. I know that now. I knew it the second she pointed at me and screamed like I was already a stranger to her. You were never a stranger to her, I said. That's what makes this unforgivable. She trusted you before she had words to know what trust even means. And you spent it. I have made peace, over the years, with betrayal from enemies. It costs nothing, emotionally, when a stranger tries to destroy you. It is an entirely different kind of wound when the man who has stood at your shoulder through every war you've fought decides your daughter's life is a debt worth trading. I didn't kill him. I want you to know that, because I know what world I operate in, and I know what you might be expecting. I gave him 1 hour to leave the city, and I told him if I saw his face again, Amara's instincts wouldn't be the only warning system standing between him and what came next. I don't know if that was mercy or weakness. I've stopped being sure there's a difference, some nights. For 3 days after Rosha left, the house was quiet in a way that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. I found myself checking the locks twice, then a third time, standing outside Amara's door at hours I used to spend reviewing ledgers, listening for the particular kind of silence that meant she was actually asleep, and not simply lying still while something in her small mind tracked a threat the rest of us couldn't see yet. Fola had started coming by more frequently by then, always announced, always careful, as if she understood that trust between us was a thing being rebuilt one visit at a time rather than granted all at once. On the third night, I found her in the nursery doorway, watching Amara sleep, and something about the tenderness on her face made me finally ask the question I'd been avoiding. What was her mother like? Fola didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice had gone soft in a way I hadn't heard from her before. My sister. Her name was Adiz. She had this gift too, when she was young, weaker than Amara's, but it was there. She spent her whole life being told it made her dangerous, that it made her a liability to anyone who loved her. She believed it, eventually. I think that's what killed her in the end. Not the men who came for her, but believing, long before they arrived, that she deserved to be afraid of herself. Is that what you're afraid of? I asked. That Amara will believe the same thing? I'm afraid, Fola said, that the world will teach her to be afraid of what she is before anyone teaches her it's a gift worth trusting. I watched it happen once already. I don't intend to watch it happen twice. I didn't have an answer for her that night. I only had the sound of my daughter's steady breathing in the dark, and the growing, uncomfortable certainty that keeping her safe from bullets was going to be the easier half of my job. The raid came 4 days after Rosha left, and it came exactly the way Fola had warned me it would, fast, coordinated, and aimed directly at the nursery window she'd been watching from outside my gate. I was in Amara's room when it started, which I believe now was not an accident, was in fact the only reason we survived it. She'd been restless all evening, refusing to sleep, gripping the bars of her crib and staring at the door like she could see straight through it into the hallway beyond. What is it? I kept asking her, uselessly, the way you talk to a child who cannot answer you in words, hoping the sound of your own voice will somehow translate the question into something she can respond to. Then the first window on the ground floor shattered, and I understood. I grabbed her out of the crib and moved. Not toward the main staircase, the way instinct and years of training told me to. Toward the servants' passage instead, because as I passed the nursery door, Amara's whole body twisted violently away from the main hall, and by now I trust that twist more than I trust my own eyes. Gunfire tore through the main staircase 4 seconds after we cleared the servants' passage. 4 seconds. Always 4 seconds. Like her body has calculated exactly how much warning a person needs to survive and refuses to give a moment more. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for the two of us, and I remember pressing her face into my shoulder so she wouldn't see the 2 men who came around the corner ahead of us before I had the chance to put them down. My hands were steady. My mind wasn't. Every shot I fired that night, I fired with the specific, terrible awareness that if I missed, if I hesitated even a fraction of a second longer than I had, there would be no second warning, no 4 seconds of grace to correct the mistake. Stay with me. I kept whispering into her hair, though I don't know if I was speaking to comfort her or myself. Stay with me, Amara. Somewhere above us, I heard Fola's voice for the first time, shouting orders to men I didn't recognize, and for one terrible second I believed the worst possible version of the last 2 weeks, that I had been played from the very beginning, that the woman I'd let walk out my gate had simply been gathering intelligence for this exact moment. I want to tell this next part slowly, because it's the part that changed everything, but the truth is it happened in fragments, in flashes, the way real violence always does no matter how the movies show it to you. I heard Fola's voice before I saw her. She was already inside my house, already moving through the East Wing with 2 men I didn't recognize, and for one terrible second I believed she'd led this attack herself, that everything she'd told me had been a long con to get close enough to take Amara from me directly. They think she's with me, Fola shouted, over the sound of a door being kicked in somewhere below us. That's why they hid here tonight. They think I already moved her. They're trying to flush her out before I can get her to safety. She's not going anywhere with you, I said, and I meant it as a threat, not a negotiation. I'm not here to take her, Fola said, and there was something in her face in that moment, something raw and afraid in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be afraid in front of me before. I'm here because if they find her before you get her out, none of this will matter anymore. Not the bloodline, not the prophecy, not any of it. She'll just be gone. I made a decision in that hallway that I have replayed 1,000 times since, and I still don't know if it was born from trust or desperation, and maybe by now those 2 things have become the same animal in me. I let Fola clear a path ahead of us while I carried Amara through the fire. We lost 2 of my men that night. Good men, men who'd been with me since before Amara ever existed in my life. I carry that. I will always carry that. But we made it to the panic room beneath the East Wing, and it was there, in the dark, with gunfire still echoing somewhere above us, that Amara did something she had never done before. She stopped screaming. Instead, she reached up with one small hand and pressed it flat against my chest, and she looked toward the ventilation shaft in the corner of the room, completely calm, completely certain, and she made a sound I can only describe as guiding. Not a warning, a direction. Fola went still beside me. She's never done that before, she whispered. Not this young. Not this clearly. Done what? Led, Fola said. She's not just sensing danger anymore, Deo. She's starting to sense the way through it. I didn't have time to sit with what that meant. I followed the direction of her small pointing hand, out through the ventilation shaft, out through a maintenance corridor I didn't even know existed beneath my own house, and it put us exactly where we needed to be to avoid the second wave of men who'd been sent to cover the exits I would have chosen on instinct. Twice in that corridor, she pressed her hand against my chest again, and both times, seconds later, I heard boots pass on the other side of a wall we would have walked straight into if we'd kept moving at our original pace. It wasn't luck anymore. I understood that now. It hadn't been luck since the parking garage. My daughter was reading the building the way I used to read a man's face before deciding whether he was lying to me. Except she was doing it through concrete and steel, through walls she had never seen and rooms she had never entered. By the time we broke into open air behind the old carriage house, I was shaking in a way I hadn't allowed myself to shake in front of anyone in years. Fola put a hand on my shoulder, steady, grounding, and for just a moment, in the middle of everything falling apart around us, it felt like the three of us were something closer to a family than I had let myself admit out loud. Comment below if you want the part 2. Meanwhile, kindly subscribe for more story.